Chapter 6. Liberalism and Catholicism. Let us examine the next group of pontifical documents, those that define liberalism in relation to the Church's doctrine on liberty, a doctrine which in fact condemns every kind of liberalism. There is a small book that I had reprinted which is valuable for helping to understand the nature of liberalism. It is Liberalism and Catholicism, an excellent collection of the conferences of Father Roussel, given between 1920 and 1936, conferences that are both simple and yet treat of the subject in a very precise way. For the word liberalism covers quite a spectrum, from the Freemasons and the 18th century philosophers to the liberal Catholics condemned by Pius IX and all the popes. We shall see when we study the encyclical Libertas of Pope Leo XIII, an important text, that it also shows the various degrees and echelons of liberalism. The object of our study is not liberalism as it is professed by its members, the Freemasons and the Protestants, for this appeared clearly when we studied the encyclicals on Freemasonry. It is liberal Catholics whom we need to scrutinize more, for they are everywhere, and they transmit a disease more difficult to diagnose. We are infected by liberal ideas, and by this impulse which too many Catholic bishops, priests, and faithful experience, often from motives of charity or apostolate, to establish contact with true liberals and enemies of the Church, rather than confront them with the truth. To respond to the objection, of course one must dialogue with those whom one hopes to convert. But this is not the objective of so-called liberal Catholics. They do what is described in certain articles worth consulting in the Dictionary of Catholic Theology in the 9th book, Catholic Liberalism. There is a very well-prepared article in column 509 that is very interesting. Here is a passage which shows how this liberalism is defined. Quote, "The liberal Catholics have not ceased to reply that they have a will to orthodoxy equal to that of the most intransigent, and that their only care is the interests of the Church. The compromise they seek is not theoretical and abstract, but rather practical." End quote. There they go off into a false distinction which they call, quote, "the thesis and the hypothesis." Quote, "This is not a compromise of law, but of fact. If their adversaries condemn them, it is because they examine their theories from the point of view of the, quote, thesis, whereas they themselves take the point of view of the, quote, hypothesis, that is, according to the facts. Their point of departure is practical principle, and fact they judge undeniable. This principle is that the Church cannot be understood in the concrete environment where she must accomplish her divine mission without harmonizing herself with it." End quote. It is subtle reasoning. The Church can never make herself heard in the concrete milieu without chiming with it. But how well? If it entails wetting the errors of the milieu, what is the Church doing there? It certainly is not preaching the faith. The theory, they say, is one thing, and they agree with us on the theory. Truth cannot compromise with error. One cannot mix light and darkness. They agree. But leave that aside, say they. Our concern is the task of the apostolate, a matter of practice. What must we do? We must know how to put ourselves on the same wavelength as others, that is to say, adopt their way of thinking and understanding. This is how one starts to mix error with truth. The liberal Catholic betrays his religion. The liberals do not have a scholastic mind. St. Thomas teaches that obviously there are principles, and they exist to be put into practice. Thus, as Father Berto would say, all practice can be reduced to good Thomistic principles. The principles must guide our action by the virtue of prudence, of course, which teaches us how to proceed in order to apply the principles. But one cannot say that the principles are one thing and that they can be dispensed with once you begin to act. This is the case of a liberal who is a Catholic in his family life. At home, morning prayer and evening prayer are said as a family. They go to Mass on Sunday and respect the pastor. But away from home, in practicing his profession, in politics, and in public life, you will find him aligned with the socialists and perhaps even with the communists. He is favorable to all that the enemies of the Church propagate. Then he is no longer a Catholic. He gives his vote to anyone or any party. He is in favor of divorce. But he will insist that in his family they are fervent Catholics. Outside, he practically goes over to the enemy. He is in a state of perpetual contradiction, because, he reasons, that the political domain has nothing to do with the Catholic sphere. The Catholic viewpoint is narrow, whereas his is broader. One must, after all, know how to get along with others, and be able to work with them. Then he may reason thus out of ambition, because he desires to become representative or mayor of his town. In this case, it's over. He has an entirely different attitude and a different way of looking at things. It is terrible because he really betrays his religion. In the book by Father Roussel, there are several passages of an extremely interesting bibliography. Unfortunately, the books are out of print and can only be found at the used booksellers or estate sales. Vatican II. The Triumph of Liberalism. The Church is dying from liberalism, for ever since the Council, it has been penetrated by it. The division between cardinals appeared clearly even when I was a member of the Central Preparatory Commission of the Council. It was comprised of 66 cardinals, about 20 archbishops and bishops, and the 4 superiors general of the great religious orders. The Central Commission was presided over by Pope John XXIII, who visited it frequently. All the texts were centralized there. Very quickly, a division between the cardinals was manifested. There were liberal, conservative, and traditional cardinals. Such a division within the Church had never been seen before. It began when Catholic liberalism was born in order to favor the French Revolution. Churchmen wanted to come to an understanding with the Revolution, so as not to be obliged to oppose it. The popes, on the contrary, condemned the Revolution and all its bad principles. But the reaction of Catholics like Lamennais or even Montalembert and others in France and elsewhere was that an arrangement had to be made. The fighting could not go on forever. They desired to make a compromise between the principles of the Revolution and Catholicism. In the last analysis, they wanted to wed the Church and the Revolution. Ever since that time, a fundamental breach appeared in the Church between those who remained firmly opposed to these principles and those who wanted to accommodate them. That this is so is attested by many. In the work The Post-Catholic Liberal by Prelot, which retraces the history of liberalism, one finds a very significant passage. Quote, "Liberalism triumphed at Vatican Council II after a century and a half of fights and condemnations." He means condemnations coming from Rome. "Finally, after an incessant struggle, the moment came for liberalism to triumph. This triumph was Vatican Council II." End quote. Here, then, is a clear and concise testimony, so to speak. It is laymen who make this assessment, like Henri Fesquet in Le Monde. All the great liberals have either said or written that, at Vatican Council II, their principles triumphed. Why was liberalism able to win at the council? Because it was a pastoral council. Had it been a dogmatic council, the Holy Ghost would have prevented liberalism from prevailing. But it was a pastoral council that was not intended to define truths. Popes John the 23rd and Paul the 6th asserted this repeatedly. It is the only instance in the history of the Church that a council was pastoral. The Church had only convened councils in order to define or make more explicit certain truths against the errors that were being spread throughout the world. What the Council Fathers could and should have condemned was communism, for example. If at the time of Vatican Council II there was a grave error threatening to dominate the world, it was communism. Communism should have been studied in depth, and the Church met in council should have condemned it, along with socialism. It would have been necessary to study the errors in depth, draft the theses, give complete descriptions, and then pronounce condemnations. Then the council could have been eminently useful. But it was just a pastoral council that had no precise goal. One wanted simply to address a message to the whole world. What happened was that the liberal influence held sway, and it was the liberals who dominated the course of the council. They were able to silence one after the other the conservative cardinals. One felt that events favored the liberals, and that Paul VI upheld them against those who wanted to maintain tradition and keep the faith. Now that we perceive the disastrous consequences, it is important to understand liberalism and to see the influence it exercised. From the fact of not wanting, apparently, to fix any precise objective for the council, one ended by trying to marry error and truth, and engendered total confusion. Such confusion has arisen that people no longer know what they must believe, what they must not believe, how to distinguish virtue and vice, truth and error. The new catechisms no longer define truth. As for morals, what is being taught, for example, concerning marriage, nothing is left but complete disorder. There are other works that are very helpful in studying liberalism. For example, the very interesting book by the deputy Émile Keller called Le Syllabus, Pie IX et les Principes de 89, the Syllabus, Pius IX, and the Principles of 89. Another source of information is the Treatise on the Church by Cardinal Biot. In Tome 2 of his De Ecclesia, on the relations of the Church and civil society, the author devoted about 40 pages to the error of liberalism. One reads there, for example, quote, "Liberalism, taken as an error in matters of faith and religion, is a varied doctrine that, more or less, aims at freeing man from God, his law, and revelation, and consequently destroys all dependence of civil society vis-a-vis religious society, that is, the Church, who is the guardian, interpreter, and teacher of the divinely revealed law. Cardinal Biot explains liberalism very well, which he defines as being an incoherence. Why? Because on the one hand, the liberal Catholic affirms his faith, but on the other, in action, he does not act according to the faith. He is in a state of perpetual contradiction. It is very striking.